Vice President J.D. Vance was in Maine today to talk about fraud and the cost of fraud in our political system. And this is part of a program that the Trump administration has been pushing since March. The idea that the real problem with our government is that certain people, and usually they're people that are coded Black or immigrant, are creating fraud in our system. And you remember this from the very beginning of the second Trump administration when Elon Musk and his Department of Government Efficiency people came in and said they were combating waste, fraud, and abuse. It became sort of this catchphrase. And of course, we know that, in fact, they saved no money at all from the government. But what they did do was they cut a lot of programs that people cared deeply about, and they scooped up a lot of our identifying information into private databases that are now being used in ways that were not apparently legal. So this idea of there being fraud out there is very much a political project. And I wanted to give you a little bit of background about what was going on with it. So the Republicans have perfected a technique for a long time now. It's really became very obvious in the 2000 presidential election, but it's an old propaganda technique in which you accuse your opponent of what you yourself are doing. And we tend to identify that in modern American politics with Karl Rove, who's a Republican operative, but in fact, it's an old propaganda technique that is often identified with Nazi Germany. And the idea behind it is that if you accuse your opponent of what you are doing, it's very difficult then for people to understand when the opponent comes back and says, well, wait a minute, you're doing it too. And what that does is it creates confusion so that people tend to throw out both sides of the equation and say, well, they're both corrupt or neither is corrupt. It muddies the waters around that issue. And you saw it, for example, with the Republicans going after the presidential campaign of John Kerry, accusing him of being weak on defense and actually not being part of the American military the way he had been. That was the swift boating, it was called, of John Kerry. And, you know, it managed to erase that real strength of Kerry's campaign from the political equation because they had managed to accuse him of being weak on support for the military when it was in fact the other way around. So what you're seeing right now with this attempt to suggest that opponents of the Republicans are creating fraud is really this political technique brought into the modern moment. And just let me lay out some of the facts first and then explain to you what I think is going on. So Maine is a great example of a place where the Republicans are insisting that there's a huge amount of Medicaid fraud that in fact is not borne out by the actual numbers. So, you know, in any program, private as well as public, there's always going to be fraud, but because people are going to people, right? But there are actually a number of organizations, anytime that you have a federal program that is designed to guarantee that there isn't that kind of fraud in a huge way. So federal reviewers, people from the federal government who reviewed the Maine Medicaid program. And remember, Medicaid pays for elder care, a lot of elder care and hospitals and so on. So it's pretty popular in Maine, you know, that you know, this is where people are getting their attention for their older relatives and for older people themselves. Federal reviewers identified only about 0.1% of total program spending as monetary losses where payments were determined to be incorrect. Now, that's going to be a lot lower than what you're hearing from people like J.D. Vance, because he's focusing on what are called improper payments. But improper payments are almost always paperwork issues. That is, they'll be missing paperwork or incomplete paperwork, or the documents were submitted incorrectly, or there was an administrative mistake, or there's a place where you need additional